Hello and welcome to this webinar launching a new policy report on diplomacy, geopolitics, and global Orthodox Christianity. My name is Judd Birdsall. I serve as a senior research fellow at the Berkley Center at Georgetown University and also as the director of the Transatlantic Policy Network on Religion and Diplomacy, the TPNRD. The TPNRD is a forum of diplomats from North America and Europe who collaborate on issues related to faith and foreign policy. And part of what we do in the life of the TPNRD is gather these diplomats twice a year for conferences in different places in the world. And in preparation for those conferences, we commission experts to write papers on topics that are of interest to our diplomats and their respective foreign ministries and of relevance to the places in which we are going to be meeting. Earlier this year, we met in Istanbul at the invitation of the Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople. It was an opportunity to engage directly with the Orthodox Church, learn more about the issues facing global Orthodoxy, particularly as they intersect with geopolitical issues, Russia's invasion of Ukraine being the most salient currently. And as we thought about who might write a paper for us on the geopolitics of Christian Orthodoxy, the first name that came to my mind was Elizabeth Prodromou. And I was delighted that she was willing to write this policy brief for us, to join us in person in Istanbul, and in many ways help us to translate between the worlds of religion and diplomacy. Dr. Prodromou is a visiting professor in the International Studies program at Boston College, and also a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. Before I turn the floor over to Dr. Prodromou, I should just mention that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be posted to YouTube and our website within a few days. You'll receive an email notifying you that it's online. Feel free to share it with friends and colleagues once it's public. And also, we want this to be an interactive event, so be thinking of questions that you might want to pose to Dr. Prodromou. You can ask your question anytime by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Feel free to let us know who you are, where you're coming from, and do be as brief as you can be in framing and phrasing your question. Thank you for joining us. Well, Dr. Prodromou, thank you so much for writing the paper, for joining us in Istanbul, and for joining me now to publicly launch the paper.
Thank you, Dr. Birdsall. Thank you, Judd. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. I want to thank you and your capacities with the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown, and also with TPNRD, the Transatlantic Policy Network on Religion and Diplomacy, for convening us here today. I appreciate the chance to talk about the white paper. Since the white paper is available online, I'm not going to, rehash or go through the entire paper itself, but what I thought would be useful is to share some of the key points that deserve amplification, and also to address some gaps that are primarily due to the fact that the paper was at press as some recent events developed. So I'll touch on those as well. And I certainly look forward to discussion, Q&A. By way of background, you mentioned that the paper was commissioned and written as part of the TPNRD visit to Turkey, to Istanbul. And so I think it's helpful to know that the paper is a combination, involves a combination of field research, that visit abroad, several other trips abroad, meetings with diplomats, with political leaders, with religious leaders, and NGO groups, NGO leaders here in the US and also in Europe and Eurasia. So in addition to the field work, there was ample desk research that's gone into the paper as well. Now, the purpose of the paper, I think, is pretty straightforward. You mentioned the TPNRD context, but I think it's important to point out that this paper comes within a context when states, I think, all over the world recognize the need to understand and find creative tools and channels of engagement that can have real impact on the ground when it comes to working with religious communities, and in this case, churches and religious communities. And I think at the same time, we see that churches and religious communities, and again, this applies across faith traditions, but I'll focus here on Orthodoxy, are coming into their own in terms of recognizing their own unique assets and skills for problem solving and partnering and mutual stakeholder approaches to some of the most complex problems that in our world. And that includes things, and some of this is in here, includes things like the phenomenon of modern slavery. It includes climate disruption and climate change, distress migration, and certainly issues related to war and peace. So that's the framework for the paper, for the white paper. And that implies then, four main goals in terms of how this paper is structured. The first is, the effort to address orthodoxy as a relatively unknown quantity for most policymakers until quite recently. And by that, I would mean really since the end of the Cold War. And in that regard, the timeline are these key benchmarks from, the 1990s wars of Yugoslav secession to the 2008, 2014, and 2022 events with Russian invasion of Georgia, annexation of the Crimea, and invasion of Ukraine. Also, the 2016 Holy and Great Council of Orthodox Churches in Crete that was convened by Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew of Constantinople. And then finally, the 2019 January event whereby the Patriarchate of Constantinople granted the Tomos of autocephaly, self-governance, to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. So addressing orthodoxy as a kind of unknown quality and really helping to ramp up what we might call the religious literacy on the diplomatic side when it comes to understanding what is the Orthodox Church as a global transnational entity. That was a big part of this, this white paper. Another important part of it was to elucidate the internal pluralism and diversity of Orthodox churches around the world. And certainly since 2016 at Crete and then 2019 with the Ukraine decision, to elucidate the contours of what has become tension and on the part of Moscow, a rupture between Moscow and the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople. And by the way, I'm just going to use Moscow, Constantinople in their ecclesiastical terms throughout this this presentation. The other piece of the paper that became important was to try to dispel some of the myths and stereotypes about orthodoxy that I think have, occluded or impeded sound policy engagement. And, policymakers have lost opportunities because of some of the kind of conventional stereotypes, namely as those relate to the mistaken application of the term Caesaro-papism to Orthodox churches, and also to this view that Orthodox churches are fundamentally quietistic and inward-looking, and therefore not interested in public engagement in the public sphere. The other two goals of the white paper are to try to identify some of the specific strengths that Orthodox churches and communities around the world can bring to priorities that may be associated with the transatlantic alliance, but I think more broadly include material and normative priorities related to social and economic justice and universal human rights. And then finally, the last goal in the paper is to try to identify, make clear the internal and external sources of threat that explain the orientation of different Orthodox churches towards these kind of material and normative points that I mentioned moments ago. So that said, let me highlight just a few key points in the white paper. Let's see, and Judd, feel free to jump in if I'm going, too far over time. But the first part of the white paper begins with a pretty extensive introduction to the historical experiences and the territorial and cultural geographies of the Orthodox Christian world today. And a few key points I think are important. First of all, we're talking about, to put it in secular terms or institutional terms, we're talking about the organizational chart of global orthodoxy. And the key point there, I think, is that for the last 1,700 years, there's an identifiable and relatively unchanging, global institutional structure. And that is that there are 14, or since January 2019, with the Ukraine autocephaly decision, there are 15 Orthodox churches worldwide. And I qualify that in the paper because not all Orthodox churches have recognized the new Orthodox Church of Ukraine, but there are 15 Orthodox churches worldwide. They're organized according to a primacy of honor, whereby the Ecumenical Patriarch enjoys a primacy of honor, not a supremacy of power, but that conveys specific prerogatives to him and to the Phanar, which is the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And I think the most significant of these in terms of understanding the governance and daily operation of these churches is to recognize the Ecumenical Patriarchate's prerogatives to convene councils. Therefore, the council in Crete in 2016 to grant autocephalous or self-governing status to other Orthodox churches, therefore the 2019 decision on Ukraine, and also to mediate in disputes between and among other Orthodox churches. So a kind of internal conflict resolution mechanism exists in global Orthodoxy. The other important point in terms of organization and the cultural and religious geography of the Orthodox Church is that if we look at the last 1700 years of this organizational structure, what really jumps out is the defining geopolitical reality of Orthodox churches. And here I mean in Europe and Eurasia. And that's been a geopolitical reality of unfreedom. And by that, I mean things like subjugation to under the Ottoman Empire. It means pressures and privations under authoritarian and hybrid regimes today in the Middle East and Africa. And it means, almost 70 years of subordination to the anti-religious Bolshevism of the Soviet bloc, and to the hybrid regimes in many post-communist states in Europe. So that defining geopolitical reality creates a perception about how to engage socially, diplomatically, and geopolitically on the part of Orthodox churches, and conversely, for offices of engagement or offices of international religious freedom in tip-nerd countries, transatlantic countries, I think it helps to understand the perception, therefore, that obtains for most Orthodox churches that have long been focused on and continue to be focused on the simple priority of survival under very, very difficult regime-type conditions. So that's the key point in the first part of this paper. The second part of the paper also identifies, in terms of dispelling stereotypes, it identifies some key doctrinal or theological and therefore practical tools that are part of the Orthodox tradition that I think make for the capacity to engage flexibly and according to local circumstances. And those are things like the practice of discernment or economia, and that tempers, for example, dogmatism, and instead allows an effort to balance sort of justice and mercy in human and social interactions. So again, it breaks out of rigidity. A second important teaching is an understanding of peace that rejects concepts of holy war and just war in favor of a defensive war, I would say, although that the whole approach to war and peace is being reconfigured. And in particular, we see the Moscow Patriarchate trying to develop a new and by most accounts non-traditional idea of holy war, Orthodox holy war. And then there's a theology of creation that I think is very congenial to the comprehensive security approach of the OSCE. So this is the introduction to the paper that helps sort of lay out the terrain for understanding how Orthodox churches have experienced and today see the world, and also for their capacity for engagement and cooperation with in diplomacy and geopolitics. The paper then, I go on in the paper to talk about sort of the key issue in global Orthodoxy today, which is the Moscow-Constantinople tension, and in particular, Moscow's very systematic effort to supplant Constantinople, the Ecumenical Patriarchate, as the global center of global Orthodoxy. And the paper goes into detail about what are the drivers for that and what have been the consequences. But I think the two most important points for our purposes are, number one, that that competition driven by Moscow has led to a kind of fracturing in the unity of global Orthodoxy, and instead it's been replaced by a kind of zero-sum zero-summism when it comes to how Orthodox churches understand the way they engage with one another and how they practice on the ground cooperatively on some of the key policy issues that I mentioned earlier. And most specifically, I think we know that Orthodox churches around the world perceive that they must take a side, to put it in the vernacular, either the side of Moscow or the side of Constantinople. And what's at issue there? The granting of the Tomos of Autocephaly by Constantinople, which Moscow has called illegitimate, and as a consequence has ruptured formal relations with the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And that's led then to a cascading effect, whereby, as I said, Orthodox churches around the world feel that they have to choose one side or the other. In many ways, it's straitjacketed them in terms of their ability to cooperate at the local and transnational levels on critical policy issues that involve not only their own survival, but broader policy questions that affect everything from political disorder, war and peace, to economic and social justice and environmental and climate change. And then finally, I think simultaneous with that, the Russia's invasion of Ukraine has been filtered in the Kirill-Putin partnership through, in part, that lens of the granting of the Tomos of Autocephaly. So for the first time, we're seeing in global orthodoxy the contours of remarkable fragmentation and rupture, not the kind of competitive pluralism or denominationalism that we see in some other contexts, but in this case, a brittleness and a rigidity that has been in large part due to this sequence of events from the Council of Crete to the granting of autocephaly to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the Moscow Patriarchate's unfortunate support for that, ongoing support for that invasion. The remainder of the paper does a deeper dive into the Ukraine context. I think it's a mistake on the policy side, and I emphasize this in the paper, to focus all policy questions, engagement around this axis, this triangular axis of Moscow, Constantinople, Ukraine. There are other things happening all over the Orthodox world, from Africa to the Middle East to the Americas to East Asia, where Orthodox churches are engaged in problem solving and activities that I mentioned at the end. Issues related to human rights and religious freedom, issues related to combating modern slavery, and that includes everything from human trafficking and human smuggling to knowledge building and training when it comes to law enforcement questions, issues related to supply chain awareness and how to teach people about those things. So to reduce the entire Orthodox global map to the Ukraine question or the Moscow-Constantinople tension, I think, is to miss these other opportunities for engagement on very specific policy questions. And finally, with regard to the Ukraine question, and here are some of the things that I think could, have been more amplified in the paper. One is to focus on the issue of the Ecumenical Patriarchate and its condition of captivity, and I think that's an accurate descriptor in Turkey. And by captivity, I mean the remarkable century-long set of legal and paralegal and social forms of persecution and discrimination that limit the capacity of the Ecumenical Patriarchate to speak freely, to engage actively in ways that are very, very consistent and hospitable vis-a-vis ideas of universal human rights, rule of law, and a rules-based international order. So the tendency to focus overwhelmingly on Moscow and Ukraine tends to take the eye off the ball, I think, in policy terms, of the other the key important voice when it comes to a rules-based international order, and that is the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Istanbul, and to begin to unpack and respond practically to the privations that are imposed on that patriarchate. The other, and we can talk more about these details, and the connective dots between what's happening inside Turkey and its impact on global orthodoxy. And the other piece of the white paper that I think deserves amplification are the recent discussions in the Ukrainian parliament in Kyiv about changes to religious freedom legislation there, which seek to balance certainly religious freedom priorities on the one hand with security priorities on the other. But the questions about the content of the legislation, and most importantly, I think, the legal dimensions, the judicial dimensions of implementing that legislation will have important impacts on a post-war Ukraine. And I think that's something that deserves greater discussion than the paper allowed at the time. So I'll close here and look forward to questions and conversation. And again, thank you for commissioning the paper and for holding today's webinar.
Well, thanks so much, Dr. Perdomo, for that orientation to the paper and for situating it within this broader historical and theological and geopolitical context. A reminder to our audience, you can type your questions at any point. We have a couple good ones already. Feel free to add to those questions. Maybe just to kick things off, Elizabeth, a question for you. I was really struck when we were in Istanbul with you at the Ecumenical Patriarchate by the asymmetries in global orthodoxy today, the asymmetry of the historical role of the Ecumenical Patriarch versus all the much greater numbers and resources that you have in Moscow. You just touched on this, the asymmetry of the relations that Constantinople and Moscow have with the state in which they find themselves, all the oppression from the Turkish government versus all the support, material and otherwise, from the Russian government for the Moscow Patriarchate. So many different asymmetries now playing out in Africa and elsewhere in this contestation. And I'm mindful you said don't reduce all of Orthodoxy to this contestation, but I'm wondering, given these asymmetries, how do you see this playing out over in the coming years or decades? Is there a way that Orthodoxy can sort of regain some equilibrium, or is there always going to be this contestation between the new Rome and the supposed third Rome in Moscow?
Judd, I think that it's fair to say that the contest, which in many ways is a one-sided contest, when someone picks a fight, then there's a response. So I would say the contest in that regard is one-sided insofar as Moscow has invested enormous religious resources and then a whole set of material and normative assets that they deploy for influence building vis-a-vis the goal of supplanting the Ecumenical Patriarchate. I don't see that there's no evidence to indicate that approach will end anytime soon. And certainly under the present leadership of Moscow Patriarch Kirill, given his Faustian bargain with Vladimir Putin, there's no evidence to suggest that there'll be a change of course in the short or medium term. So this is something that I think for Orthodox churches worldwide, they're going to continue to have to negotiate and navigate. And I think over time, what we've seen historically in the Orthodox world when there have been disputes is that with time, those disputes are usually resolved, and in the case of the Ukraine decision, will likely be resolved with more and more Orthodox churches recognizing the Orthodox Church of Ukraine's autocephaly. However, that will be, I think, a protracted process, and it's one that will occur within the context of Moscow using all of the influence building tools at its disposal. And again, I've written elsewhere about this, but by influence building tools, I mean the things that state and non-state actors use today. And that's economic and financial incentives. That is digital disinformation and misinformation, and also the public sphere digitized and globalized of, a contestation of ideas, and then participation in multilateral and transnational institutional environments where that competition can be waged. So I think we're going to continue to see that. I think the other important point is to recognize that there's an unequal playing field. And the reason that the playing field is unequal is because, as you pointed out, the Patriarchate of Moscow enjoys the full support of the Russian state. The Ecumenical Patriarchate, lives under a state of siege. And I think, that's something that is far too frequently overlooked, but these are facts on the ground. The Ecumenical Patriarchate's capacity is in many ways constrained by virtue of this siege condition. And the siege comes directly from a centuries-long set of policies by the Turkish state. And people tend to focus on the last 20 years of the Erdogan regime, but I think it's important to recognize that what the Erdogan regime has done is really continue the policies that were designed and implemented under the 80 years of Kemalism. So in order for the Ecumenical Patriarchate not only deploy its own capacity worldwide and its churches worldwide for the kind of policy issues that TIPNERD is concerned with, but also for TIPNERD and for transatlantic states to enjoy credibility and legitimacy, it's important to move beyond kind of discursive flourishes that decry the ongoing closure of the Halki Theological School, or that decry Turkey's violations of its obligations of UNESCO when it arbitrarily reverted Hagia Sophia from a museum to a mosque. And in fact, to use the policy tools at the disposal, not simply to try to punish Russia, which is understandable given their invasion of Ukraine, but also to get the Turkish state to comply with its own international obligations. So I think, it's interesting if we begin to dissect the behaviors of these two states towards those that they see as enemies. We see the Moscow Patriarchate very clearly behaving in the occupied territories in Ukraine and through its invasion of Ukraine towards those that they see as enemies. But the Turkish state has been very clear in treating the Ecumenical Patriarchate and all Orthodox Christians, and by extension, other Christian communities and the Jewish community as fifth columns. And I think that's something that needs to be taken into account in thinking about the short and medium term contours of the Moscow-Constantinople tension and its globalizing implications.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Well, we have a bunch of good questions now, so let's just dive right in. And we've got, thankfully, a half hour for engagement with our audience. Let me start with Dr. Ari Magelis, who's joining us from Greece. He's a researcher in IR and geopolitics. His question for you is, Turkey can de facto influence the affairs of the Ecumenical Patriarch. What is Turkey's stance towards Moscow's policy to weaken the Ecumenical Patriarch, especially regarding the creation of a Russian exarchate within Turkey?
I think we know from what we know. There are a lot of unknowns, but what we do know is that the Turkish state has been relatively open to hasn't impeded the efforts of the Moscow Patriarchate and the state-supported efforts of the Moscow Patriarchate to pressure Constantinople, both inside Turkey and in other parts of the world. And here I refer specifically to the Stavropegyal spaces of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. Whether or not the Moscow Patriarchate will establish an exarchate inside Turkey, I think that's a big question mark. We've seen them do that in Africa. They've been very clear that decision was a punitive decision on their part. They said that they're punishing the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Alexandria for recognizing the autocephaly of Ukraine. So if I were a betting person, which I'm not, but if we were forecasting, I might say that it's a matter of time until the Moscow Patriarchate establishes an exarchate inside Turkey. That calculus will also depend on, or the outcome will depend on the calculus of the Turkish state. And I would say that calculus is based on one simple consideration: whether or not the establishment of a Russian exarchate inside Turkey will advance the Turkish state's objectives of ending the existence of the Ecumenical Patriarchate. And I think, again, that will depend on a whole set of calculations that also go beyond the Russia-Turkey relationship and feed into the broader set of issues related to NATO membership and Turkey's blocking of Sweden's membership of NATO. So I think the medium term will tell. But at the end of the day, the calculus on the part of the Turkish state will be how an exarchate does or does not advance the Turkish state's goals when it comes to what's been clear for the last century with Constantinople, which is to eliminate the living Greek Orthodox community and to end the existence of the Ecumenical Patriarchate, certainly in Constantinople.
All right. Two questions coming to us from Pedro Constantino, who's a PhD student in international relations in Portugal. His first is, in your opinion, did Patriarch Kirill have any influence on Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, or did Putin push Kirill into supporting the war? He also asks, how valid are the theories of symphonia and Caesaropapism from the Byzantine Empire in current Kemal politics? I hope I read that right. But so a question about Kirill and support for the war, and then this issue that you touched on briefly in your remarks, Caesaropapism, and also symphonia.
Okay. Again, regarding the Putin-Kirill partnership, and I think that is indeed what it is. It's evolved over time, but it's now a full-blown partnership, and it's one from which an exit for either side, I think, is going to be impossible. I have no way of knowing whether Kirill pressured Putin or Putin pressured Kirill. What I do know is that the geopolitical perspective that we can apply to how Moscow saw NATO's steady enlargement has been equally active in the way in which the Moscow Patriarchate and Kirill have narrated the decision on autocephaly. So the Moscow Patriarchate, and you can see it in every digital space. The Moscow Patriarchate's narrative is a narrative of Orthodox geopolitical hegemony. Their goal is to accomplish hegemony as leader of the Orthodox world, and they see the decision on autocephaly as illegitimate and an encroachment on their territories, their near abroad, their religious near abroad. So I think there's a parallelism, and there's certainly a reflexivity. I think it's impossible. Certainly, I cannot answer that question categorically about who pushed whom. But what we do know is that the perspective, the geopolitical lens applied, is very similar, whether we're talking about the Russian state or the Moscow Patriarchate, and the bargain, therefore, between the two of them, a kind of reflexivity to support territorial revisionism and religious nationalism is one that shows there's no indication of any change in that in the near or medium term future. Regarding the question of Caesaropapism and Symphonia, there's a huge literature on the mistaken application of the term Caesaropapism to the Byzantine symphonic model. Undoubtedly, enormous influence by the state on the church, and vice versa. So there's a big literature that deconstructs that term and why it doesn't accurately capture that relationship. But there are huge debates in the Orthodox world, and I think this is the key point that bears emphasis, that there are big debates today in the Orthodox world about the proper relationship, the optimal arrangement between churches and states. And those range everywhere from Caesaropapist approaches to full separation approaches. And they occur within the context of and with regular reference to and a demonstrated understanding of the panoply of models that we see around the world when it comes to religion-state relations. And so I think for policymakers, and certainly for scholars, the important point is to recognize the pluralism that exists within global orthodoxy, and certainly to move away from this mistaken argument that there's something intrinsic in Orthodox theology that leads inexorably to a kind of Caesaropapism. That's both theologically mistaken and it's empirically invalid if we look at historical cases around the world and the present moment.
And I imagine many in our audience are familiar with those terms. Do you want to just take a second to define Symphonia and Caesaropapism for members of the audience who might not be as familiar with those terms?
Sure. Well, I mean, Caesaropapism is a term that refers to Caesar's, control over the church, Caesar and Pope. So Caesaropapism is a term that suggests that the state and the head of state is also the head of church, and by extension controls the church and is able to intervene in the regular activities of the church. The term symphonia refers to the arrangement in the Byzantine period from the 4th century to the 15th century of the arrangement between the church in Constantinople, or the Eastern Orthodox Church on the one hand, and the Byzantine state and the emperor on the other hand, which in ideal typic terms, is described as a kind of perfect relationship, a perfect balance whereby state and church are committed to the same objective, which at that point in time was to spread the good news or the message of Christianity, and to missionize and therefore create, to grow the boundaries of Christendom. And that in some ways is the sort of almost caricatured perspective that many in the Moscow Patriarchate present today as the only and ideal model of religion-state relations in any Orthodox majority country. It also, I'll leave it there. Yeah, that's a rough summary of both of those terms.
Thank you. All right, still lots of good questions for us to get through in our remaining 20 minutes or so. Nina Shea asks, please elaborate on the holy war concept being developed by the Moscow Patriarchate.
Thanks for the question, Nina. The holy war concept is something that the Moscow Patriarchate has dedicated enormous intellectual capital to in this period of the Kirill-Putin partnership. There's a debate, again, in the Orthodox world, underscoring, again, the pluralism in Orthodox thought about whether or not holy war is something that can be exegeted, can be explained from Orthodox theology, and there's no consensus. I would submit that most of the literature suggests that the concept of defensive war, which was really the dominant approach to the issue of war and the church's support for or engagement in or response to war, that remains the dominant approach in Eastern Christianity today. However, there is no Christian empire today, so in some ways it's it's out of date, it's outmoded. But what that does is it moves away from a dogmatic embrace of the peace ideal as the only option, so pacifism as the only option, and it recognizes that under some conditions, and in particular, perhaps we would use the R2P concept, the responsibility to protect concept. It argues that there's a need to protect and defend those who are defenseless in the face of war. But what I think is important about that is, number one, it rejects the sacralization of war, and that's something that we're seeing in the discourse and in the discourse of the holy war concept that's being developed by Moscow, and we've seen it in Kirill's public statements, and we've seen it also in Putin's appropriation of Kirill's public statements, so that war becomes a sacred enterprise. It becomes a crusade. That's something that is alien to the Orthodox historical experience and tradition. So that's one thing. The other thing about the defensive war concept is that it tends to focus on mechanics that I think can be useful when it comes to the convergence between Orthodox thought on war and peace on the one hand, and the prosecution of war according to international human rights and humanitarian law. So if you look, for example, at Byzantine texts and military texts, and also practices of the church during the Byzantine period, you'll see that those who went and fought in war, when they came back, certain prescriptions were imposed on them within the context of their life in the church. They not being allowed to receive communion, repentance through confession, etc. But also prescriptions about how to treat prisoners of war, how to allow prisoners of war to be able to practice their faith while being held in detention. So what we see, to sum it up, what we see today, I think, are three tendencies. One, what I would call an extreme tendency, the Moscow Patriarchate's evolving sacralization of war, so the sacred holy war approach. Two, the effort to cull from the Byzantine experience and texts this concept of defensive war, and one that converges with international humanitarian and human rights prescriptions. And three, a less well-articulated effort to move in the direction of a just war theory. But all of these three tendencies are active in Orthodox theological and operational circles, practitioner circles. And I think the key point here is, again, to avoid reducing things to the loudest voice at times, which is the voice of the Moscow Patriarchate, particularly given its support for Russia's war in Ukraine.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Question from James Alexander. Hi, James. He says, you've mentioned some of the policy concerns of the Ecumenical Patriarchate to include combating global slavery and climate change. These issues are, of course, larger than any one church organization. Where is there space for collaboration between states and the Patriarchate, as well as representatives of other religious traditions, for example, Catholicism, Islam, and so on? And maybe you could speak to your own work on the Human Trafficking Task Force.
Sure, on the Task Force on Modern Slavery. I think this is one of the most optimistic and hopeful pieces of the capacity of certainly the Ecumenical Patriarchate and its jurisdictions all over the world, but of Orthodoxy writ large. And that is work on issues related to modern slavery, issues related to migration, and issues related to climate disruption. And there, I think there's infinite upside. The question was about where's there space for partnership? We're already seeing on this task force on modern slavery that was established by the Ecumenical Patriarchate, it was really consequent to conversations with the with the Anglican Church. And I haven't had my morning coffee, I confess, with the Anglican Church, with the Vatican, and with other churches and non-Christian institutions around the world about how the responsibility and the capacity then to partner in combating these different aspects of modern slavery. So we see this happening at the grassroots level, community to community, in NGOs to NGOs. We see conversations on participation in interreligious and ecumenical fora around these kinds of practical issues, how to define them, and therefore what can be done, therefore policy prescriptions. And we see participation with states and churches with states in multilateral fora. I mentioned the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and in other fora, certainly in Europe and the Americas, where these policy issues are at hand. We also see efforts in terms of the work of the task force, I can say, on just raising the literacy of local communicants about how to understand what's happening in terms of the realities of slavery in our time, and therefore raising the skill set and the competency level when it comes to things like security, how, when, and what context to interact with local security providers, how to interact with those who provide trauma support and psychosocial support for victims of human slavery, human trafficking, how to deal with questions related to the private sector and their responsibilities when it comes to supply chain issues and indentured servitude. So I think this is one of the most promising spaces where we actually do see partnerships, cooperation with ecumenical, interreligious, and state and religious stakeholders in addressing this issue. The same holds true for climate disruption and climate change. And there are, many examples of this. I'd be happy to provide some links, but there's a lot happening on the ground. And this is where I think the diplomatic engagement can do the most, to identify those spaces where there is policy capacity to support that in whatever way possible and to partner and cooperate. But this takes me back again to the broader macro questions of global orthodoxy, because if a huge impetus for some of these activities is coming from the Ecumenical Patriarchate, the Ecumenical Patriarchate's at-risk condition necessarily then, or de facto, imposes unnecessary constraints on its full capacity potential.
All right, Elizabeth. So in recent months in Washington and other Western capitals, there's been debate about how critical to be or not towards Kiev and how it's relating to the Orthodox Church still aligned with the Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. Here's a question from Pavlo Smitsnuk, apologies for any mispronunciation there, who's a postdoc at Princeton Seeger Center. He asks, do you have suggestions on how the Ukrainian government should deal with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate in the context of recent legislation? Does this issue influence U.S. policy towards Ukraine?
Well, we know there's a relatively lively discussion going on between Washington and Kyiv on the recent proposals, legislative proposals, when it comes to dealing with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, formerly Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate. The legislation, as you probably know, Pablo, the legislation deals with the effort really to balance, square the circle between for freedom of religion or belief priorities on the one hand and security, very fundamental security concerns on the other. And as I mentioned before, earlier in the presentation, I think the real concern is that the legislation itself doesn't result in two consequences. One is violations of judicial process when it comes to addressing those affiliated with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate, and they're being charged with treasonous activities. So how strong is the judicial process in bringing those accused to justice and through transparent judicial mechanisms rendering a decision? That's the first thing. The second thing, and associated with that, is to ensure that there are no indefinite administrative detentions, which again would be a violation of law, even within the context of the ongoing Russian war against Ukraine. The third thing I think of real concern is whether or not in a post-war Ukraine, legislation that might be passed now will have deleterious effects on the social reconciliation and also the quality of democracy in a post-war Ukraine. There are two perspectives on this. One is to argue that this is an existential issue. Ukraine, faces Russia's ongoing war, and that four priorities have to be seconded to, and the international law allows for this, have to be seconded to security priorities. The other perspective, I think, says, well, there are three. The other perspective says absolutely not, that it's possible to balance both of those. The third, I think, is a more mixed and perhaps prudent and judicious approach, which is, again, to focus on those key issues that presumably the Ukrainian government can control, and that's judicial process. Because there have been those who have been arrested, those who are being detained, have been charged and are being detained. They need to be prosecuted in a court of law. That's something that the Ukrainian government does have control over, and I think that's and if resources are needed, both in terms of material resources and training, that's something that can be provided, I think, by the United States and by other countries around the world, or even in crafting the final form of the legislation. For example, seeking recourse for advice to the Venice Commission. That's another thing that has been discussed. So I think this is going to be a very, very important turn for Ukraine, not only under wartime conditions, but thinking in terms of the medium term of post-war Ukraine, where religious freedom conditions in a remarkably religiously plural Ukraine will be very important in terms of any kind of truth, justice, and reconciliation and durable peace. So it's incumbent upon Kyiv, as well as the United States, discussing this with Kyiv to try to move things prudently and carefully towards a longer term outlook, not just focusing on the immediate issue of the war. And in the paper, I do discuss in the paper the importance of negotiations between the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the autocephalous church, and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, former Moscow Patriarchate. Those negotiations for some sort of full reconciliation, some argue, that might lead to a full unification. That's an ecclesiastical issue at one level, but it's also a very practical issue. And the encouragement and facilitation of those negotiations is something that will be positive for Ukraine when it comes to this kind of legislation, and in particular for social integration and inclusion.
Okay, moving from Ukraine to Cyprus, another setting of this intra-Orthodox contestation you've been talking about. Christodoulos asks us, in the past couple of years following Cyprus's political shift to the west, a lot of Russian expats moved to the Turkish-occupied North Cyprus, where they are given Greek Cypriot churches and cemeteries to operate for their newly founded Russian Orthodox Church of Northern Cyprus. How would you describe this as a direct involvement of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Russian state in one of the Ecumenical Patriarch's oldest jurisdictions? Is it an example of the instrumentalization of the church by the Russian state?
Thanks for the question. I haven't been to the occupied section for some years, although I have traveled to Turkish-occupied Cyprus. This takes us back to two kinds of geopolitics. The first is the obvious issue of geopolitics among states. Turkey has occupied Cyprus. It'll be half a century in July of 2024, with absolutely no consequence from the international community. And one of the consequences, however, in the occupation zone when it comes to the geopolitics of religion is that we have seen the full cleansing of the Christian communities, the Greek Orthodox, Maronite, Latin, Armenian communities from the occupation zone, other than a very small group of a remnant community of elderly Greek Orthodox Cypriots. So that's, I think, the starting point here, because it goes back to the disproportionate influence of states, whether it's the Kremlin or whether it's Ankara, on the geopolitics of religion. So the cleansing of the Orthodox and other Christian communities from occupied Cyprus has in many ways created a tabula rasa when it comes to religious actors from outside the island. And here we go then to the activities of the Moscow Patriarchate. The occupation zone is a no man's land. It's a space that's a violation of international law, but where all manner of gray and black activities occur. And I think the establishment of Russian Orthodox churches there, undoubtedly with the support of the so-called, Orthodox oligarchs who support the Putin-Kirill partnership, is something that again gives the Moscow Patriarchate and Russia as an aligned actor a foothold in the EU space and by extension the transatlantic space. But the key point here is that it's something that's facilitated by a transatlantic member state, and that's Turkey. And I think it's important for us to keep our eye on that point, because the ease with which this is happening, which then involves the kind of religious geopolitical competition that we've been talking about, and a perspective on everything from war and peace to human trafficking and human slavery to universal human rights. That religious geopolitical competition is enabled and facilitated by state decisions. And in this case, it's two states that are rogue states, and that is Russia and Turkey. And so I think that this is an issue of high geopolitics, and until transatlantic states actually take seriously what the Turkish occupation in the north, then the Moscow Patriarchate, with the full support of the Kremlin and the Orthodox oligarchs who figure into both of those ecosystems, will continue their activities. And that includes everything from expropriating properties that belong to those who have been expelled since the Turkish invasion and occupation. And it also means all form of economic black market activities, financial activities, and the whole host of criminal activities that are usually associated therewith.
Thank you. Okay, we just have a few minutes left. Let me give the final question to Konstantinos Alexandros. Thank you for joining us. There's a few other questions that we won't have time to get to. Apologies to those audience members who posed a number of other good questions. But one of the themes that you highlight in your policy brief is a generational change. And so I think this is a good question as we look toward both the recent past and also to the future. Konstantinos says, Dr. Perdomo, thank you for this insightful analysis. The last 30 years under Patriarch Bartholomew, the Ecumenical Patriarchate has become more active with regards to its ecumenical mission, raising its voice in a series of global issues. We've touched on climate and trafficking and so on. Do you see the spirit of this engagement, which is actually the very essence of the Patriarchate's ecumenical role, being widely shared by the clergy of the Ecumenical Patriarch, thus ensuring its continuation in the future?
Thank you, Constantino, for the question. I mentioned leadership in the paper in the following context, that we are beginning to see a quite significant leadership transition in global orthodoxy. And I focused on a few examples, for one of which being, and this relates to the question by the previous person, the recent election of a new Archbishop of the Church of Cyprus, which is an autocephalous church, which has recognized the autocephaly of the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. We've seen through natural causes. In this case, the Archbishop was elderly and infirm, and he passed away. We've seen the consequences of COVID and leadership transitions. A new patriarch of Serbia, for example, consequent to the COVID pandemic. And we're also seeing, in the case of the Church of Greece, another autocephalous church that has also recognized the Autocephalous Church of Ukraine, we're seeing either elderly and or infirm hierarchs begin to retire. And most recently we had, we see the appointment of new metropolitans, hierarchs. This leadership, the causes for the leadership transition aside, it's happening. And what does that mean for the kinds of capacity, skills, and cooperation that we've been talking about? On the one hand, I think that it will facilitate the mission of the Ecumenical Patriarchate and its stated commitments to norms, universal human rights, rule of law that we've been discussing. On the other hand, it sets up competitive dynamics between older, both generationally and also in terms of perspective, decision makers in these churches. And as a consequence, I think the key point from my perspective is the importance of leadership training. And one of the things that I have found, remarkable and encouraging is that from the Ecumenical Patriarchate to several other Orthodox churches, an openness to skills and capacity building training amongst decision makers, priests and hierarchs, and also lay persons in these Orthodox churches writ large. So there's a recognition that leadership matters, not only for what happens inside the churches, but most importantly, in some ways, from the perspective of diplomatic engagement, what the churches can bring to the public sphere and civil society, and also to actions and discourse related to war and peace. I also think the other important part on the leadership issue is a recognition that leadership skills and capacity can draw on the well springs and the teachings of Orthodoxy, which goes back to one of the previous questions, Nina Shay's question about the developments in just war, holy war, defensive war theory, and Orthodoxy. The leadership training can easily draw from the teachings of Orthodoxy to take practical steps in one direction or another. And so what we're seeing, and I've architected and participated in, designed many of these leadership training seminars, is an effort to draw on the indigenous ideas and teachings of Orthodoxy in ways that are compliant with, supportive of, and compatible with rule of law and universal human rights. And I think we're going to continue to see that. And I think certainly in the churches that have already recognized the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, we're seeing, embrace of the importance of leadership training, and in other churches as well that haven't yet recognized the Orthodox Church of Ukraine, the autocephalous church. So leadership, I think, is going to be a critical element moving forward in terms of who are the leaders, what kind of training they have, and what are the institutional tools at their disposal to do the kind of partnering that we've been talking about, either in ecumenical or interfaith context, or in multilateral contexts that involve states and non-religious NGOs.
Well, Elizabeth, unfortunately, we've come to the end of our time, but thank you so much for your presentation and for engaging so fulsomely with a wide range of questions related to a bunch of different topics and regions. Thank you for joining us in conversation today.
Thank you, Judd, for having me. And again, thank you to Georgetown, to the Berkley Center, and also to TIPNerd.
Well, you're very welcome. And to our audience, thank you for joining us. Thank you for so many good questions. Again, this recording will be on YouTube and on our website within the coming days. If you want to dig deeper into this issue, I'd encourage you to check out Dr. Perdomo's paper, which is on the Berkley Center website, as well as the website of the TPNRD, religionanddiplomacy.org. Again, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you in a future webinar.